Maybe this is the morning I'm not used to speaking in the microphone. So. Speaking as a future educator, I realize that my opinion of the power of educators is more than likely biased. However, it is through personal experiences that I've realized just how big of an impact teachers can have on students. These impacts can come in both good and bad forms, as I'm sure each of you have realized by now. I don't speak objectively, but rather as someone who has had teachers who both forced me down and helped me to soar and succeed. I speak as a student whose life was forever changed by the actions of a teacher. Now, I realize that for the most part, everyone does go through one hardship or another as a child, even if they do not realize that they are doing so. In my childhood, the hardship that I found to be most influential on my life was my speech impediment. As a child, it was evident that I was at least somewhat delayed when it came to speaking. Most people just assumed that it was because I was still young. Because my impediment was one in which I pronounced my R's like W's, I simply sounded like I was younger than I actually was. It's hard not to sound cute and young when you say Mila, girl, bud, and monster. It just sounds adorable when it's a young child saying it. However, when you get to the second and third grade, it starts to be less normal to sound like a toddler when you're speaking, as would be expected. Unfortunately, because of my speech impediment, I was still stuck in this way of speaking. My speech never really seemed like that big of a deal to me until I started second grade and encountered my first life-altering teacher. Now, mind you, she was a good teacher when it came to content, but when it came to how I would speak, she was less than understanding. I wasn't identified as having a speech impediment, so she took my way of speaking as my goofing off and trying to somehow undermine her. She would force me to reread sentences or paragraphs over and over again, wasting not just her instructional time, but my learning time and everyone else's as well. It seemed as though all she cared about was if I said the words correctly, rather than if I actually understood the content she was teaching, which in most cases I did. Having gone to the same school since kindergarten, many of the children in my class were quite used to how I spoke, and luckily enough, I was never the target for ridicule. At least that was the case up until this teacher came along. Because she would call me out on my pronunciation, she drew an inexcusable amount of attention to the fact that I spoke differently than everyone else did. At that point, it was as if the children decided that because she would point it out and embarrass me in class, spending so much time telling me I was speaking wrong on purpose, that it was okay to point it out and make fun of me for talking like a baby. It got to the point that I just stopped talking when I did not absolutely have to. For a child who was already shy, this made me extremely introverted and quiet all the time, at least while at school. That year was the first time I ever felt different for how I spoke, and it was all because the teacher impacted me in a negative way. Entering into third grade, I was afraid of what the kids would be like and what kind of teacher I would have that year. I knew that I sounded the same and I was yet another year older, so I didn't have very high hopes. I still remember the first day of school when I saw her and encountered her reaction to my speech. I read a paragraph and she corrected how a word was said. I tried to fix it, saying it out loud, knowing I was not saying it any differently than I had before. I braced for her to tell me how to read it yet again, but she didn't. She looked at me, but had us go on. Later on, as the year progressed, she would pay attention and meet with me to talk. Little did I know that she was actually paying more attention to how I said my words than anyone had ever done before. It wasn't long after that school year started that we had a visitor in the class who wanted to speak with me. My teacher and the visitor took me into our reading garden and set me down to tell me that it had been noticed that I was having a hard time saying certain sounds. As they went on, they told me that I was going to be tested to see if I had a speech impediment and see if I could be helped, and shortly after I was officially diagnosed with having a speech impediment. For the first time in my life, I knew why I had a hard time with certain words and why my speech didn't sound as grown up as it should have. And it was all because one teacher noticed something not quite right and cared. After that, I began going to speech therapy and managed to overcome my speech impediment to the best of my abilities. To this day, I still have trouble with certain words where I really have to stop and think as I say them, but for the most part, I feel as if my speech impediment is completely gone. And although it was a speech therapist who actually helped me with the therapy, I associate it almost entirely with my third grade teacher instead. I haven't told you this story to gain your sympathy about my impediment, but rather to put an emphasis on the power that teachers have on a child's life. I don't think teachers can necessarily be bad, but I firmly believe there are things that a good teacher does and things that they don't do. A good teacher cares and will do everything they can to help their children be successful. They understand the capabilities of their students and help them to reach their full potentials. While I was never able to change back to my introverted self and still have fears when it comes to public speaking, thanks to my second grade teacher, I am better able to be confident even through those fears because of my third grade teacher. I am a pre-service teacher and part of Capital to Epsilon because of those two teachers, both good and bad. I know what it is like as a child to have teachers be the driving force for your confidence, self-esteem, and self-efficacy. I know that one day each of us will be able to return the favor and serve as the driving force and inspiration for generations to come.